the University of Auckland Speech Science program moved last week, was it? It seems like a long time ago, but it was just, you know, 2 weeks ago, I guess, Monday morning, yeah, that we moved to our new premises, and we didn't know where we would even host a seminar or where people would park, since the parking is not yet constructed for our new building. So thank you to our wonderful colleagues at the university, at Massey University, for hosting and providing lovely tea and coffee, and welcome, Becky. And I think before you come here, Sally has to give some technological advice to our online colleagues who are joining us by the magical power of the internet. Right.
Oh, I hope this is going to work, Whānau. So we've got 79 people so far who are linked into us on Zoom, and some of those are groups of people. And so I'm really keeping my fingers crossed that the volume, the video, the internet link, the battery on my computer, and all of those things are going to work for us today. I'm also videoing this and audio recording it because we've had a lot of interest in this topic, and people are really super keen who can't make it for whatever reason to hear the information later. So just bear with us. Please, if you're on Zoom, use the Zoom chat. If you can't hear, or I can try and see if I can sort out what that problem might be for you. I've also got my phone next to me, which I'll be checking for text. So we'll do our absolute best. And if it fails, just go and have a nice cup of tea, and I will send you the link afterwards to access it later. Thank you.
And one last thing, just to sing Becky's praises. So one of the video resources that has been developed for this project, which is DLD 123, is it? Won the 2018 Charity Film Award in the UK. So that, I think, is pretty remarkable, isn't it, for a speech language therapist to win an award for a film that's telling people about what we work with. It's pretty special and unique. So it's wonderful to have such a multi-talented person in the field. So anyway, welcome. Yeah.
Wow. Now, do we think I need the audio on, the microphone on, Sally? Yeah. Yes, we do. Thank you so much, Suzanne. Gosh, I've never had quite such an introduction. Thank you for having me. Kia ora, I should say. That's about all I can say. So, kia ora. So we'll just click on here. Oh, sorry. It's been a lot of setup, not technology going on. Yes, perfect, thank you. So yeah, as Suzanne said, I'm a speech and language therapist, and I'm mainly a speech and language therapist, and I've been involved in a little bit of research here and there. I've been lucky enough to be involved in the catalogs and various other projects too. So my experience, I've worked for 25 years as a speech and language therapist, mainly in the educational setting, so working with children from school age and up to sort of post-16 young people at college as we call it over there, post-16, sitting sort of right through. Okay. So I'm going to talk about language difficulties, obviously, the terminology issues, awareness, identification criteria. Have a look at the history of the terminology and the current status. I'm sorry, Rebecca, can I just turn down the volume a little bit on your microphone, on you, sorry. Yeah. Sorry, I don't know. We can take it off and just shout. I think that might be okay in the room, actually. If you don't think it will, no, people don't think it will. I'm not sure how to turn that one down, but they're getting quite a lot of distortion at home from the microphone. Okay. Suzanne, do you know? Put the microphone down a bit lower. Okay. Oh, Mark. Thanks, Mark. Try talking now. Okay, is that better? Yeah. It's not really bad in this room at all. It's great. Okay. Okay, can you hear me okay now? Okay, so carry on. So looking at the history of terminology to do with language difficulties, why a change was needed, what progress we have made, and considerations going forward. Okay. And we've got some videos as well to show. And then I've got some links included within the PowerPoint and some links at the end. So I'll kind of skip through some of the links, but they'll be there and you can have the PowerPoint afterwards as well to sort of follow up and look at some of the actual papers and videos. Okay. So we'll start with a film, and hopefully I can get to it okay, just to warm us up. And can I check before I do this, is there anybody who's not a speech and language therapist in the room? Okay. And are you professionals or teachers or no? Parents? Okay. Okay. So have we got any family of people with DLD in the room? Well, lovely. Okay. So let's go to this first film. So apologies if you've seen any of these films or if I'm telling you things that you already know, but this is one of my favourite and will get us going, thinking about which children we're thinking about.
I know what it is. You know what it's like. You just can't think of a word. You know it. You just can't say it. And then you're going and straight and sometimes it like feels like you know what you're gonna say. The other person's like, and then you know what it is. It's there, but it's not actually there anymore. And you know it's like on the top of your brain, but you just can't get the word out. No? Those handles. The handles, those handles. This is called word finding difficulties. Maybe it happens to you. It can be quite frustrating. Don't worry, it happens to lots of people. Sometimes it's like we got it and then it comes back to maybe the next day or maybe 10 minutes. Sometimes it's really frustrating and I don't get it. So what can you do when this happens? Let's find out. First, you can take your time. You can tell them you're thinking or when you're stuck. Oh, this is a little bit of time. Okay. Come. We don't have that one. I did what I did. How people guess the word. You can describe it or your actions. It's what doctors use. And see how the arms go. The stairs. Sometimes when you do these things, word just pops out. A few years ago, they used it to type. I don't know if it's instead. It's like heavy. They are. If you can't think of the word, you could try drawing it. I don't get drawn my arm. student really doesn't get instruction methods, they actually get them later. So, if you're having difficulty thinking of the word, you can try taking your time, describing the word, taking actions, or drawing. How do you get your message across? Let us know if you have words finding difficulty, or how it feels to you. You can see us at Family Bank, or follow us on our Facebook page. Bye! See you guys! Okay, this is
Stop. What's that? Okay, wonderful, Eddie and Dylan. I don't know if you know Untitled Dec, but they're like our mini Untitled Dec. So a lovely little film that kind of gives you an idea of, or other people an idea of language difficulties, but also kind of shows those kids' strengths and characters as well. And as Gina pointed out, we talk about the pro-social skills. Okay, so thinking about terminology, should I go like this? This is a slide from some research I was involved in with Professor Judy Dockrell a few years back, and I interviewed about 38 speech and language therapy managers, and as part of the study we're finding out about educational provision for children with language difficulties, and as part of that interview I asked them what terms they used. So this is the managers in the UK, and you can see there's a whole range of terms even used by the sort of leaders in the departments. So many of the managers using specific, some using speech and language, and some using language, some using disorder, difficulties or impairment, so a whole mixture. This is an analysis, shows an analysis done by Professor Dorothy Bishop. And she used Google Scholar to look at the research over about period of 20 years, and found that there were these three different elements of the terminology that could be used in the publications, which combined, I think, was something like 168 different possible combinations, of which she found 133 were used at least once, and I think 33 used 600 times or more. So quite a mess, really, in terms of, you know, even within the field, us knowing who we're talking about and using consistent terminology. Now, this I find fascinating. This timeline shows the history of the terminology in publications. Just to zoom in a bit, I don't know if that's clear enough for you, but we've known about language difficulty since 1822. So the first recorded description was somebody called Gall, I think it was a French person, who talked about language problems. And then the first diagnostic label was aphasia in 1865. And you can see that whole range of terms used, including things like congenital word deafness, you know, all sorts of different terms used. Moving down to terminology that perhaps we're more familiar with, the sorts of terms that we would use ourselves. So this was looking at research. So, you know, in terms of raising awareness and helping support these young people and adults with language difficulties, if we don't even use the consistent terminology ourselves, then it's quite a problem. So at this point, can I just ask what terminology has been used in New Zealand? Is it similar to the UK? Have you had that whole kind of mixture? Yeah. So specific language impairment, is that one that you used quite a lot? Yeah. Very similar, is it? So I think SLI, specific language impairment, was used quite a lot, particularly in the research, I think, quite often in the UK. language difficulties or language disorder, or just a description, really. Okay. So does this matter? Maybe there's not many children or people who have these difficulties, and maybe there's not a great impact. So actually, it is a bit of a problem. So we know, obviously, the people in this room know how important language is. And language is key for communication, obviously. And I think sometimes we or it's easy for other people to not quite see how important it is for education and for literacy. And, you know, literacy, by and large, being language, really, language skills. A little example I show, an example of a maths worksheet for children at the primary level. And we think of maths as being numbers, but actually a great deal of language involved in maths. And more in the UK, you know, so the GCSE maths has become more and more language based. So the first question, divide 19 children equally among 4 mats. There's quite a lot of concepts, language concepts in there. And I think looking at down here, this question here, divide me by 10 and my remainder is 7. Oh, it's a question. It's not even obvious it's a question, is it? And then you've got to realise that you've got to link it with these things here. So there's a lot of language and inferencing and concepts involved. And this is an example, of some topic vocabulary from a year 8 class, a student that I was working with, and we looked at the light vocabulary. And we know, you know, that in school these topics move on quite quickly. So you've only just got started in trying to help the children with the vocabulary, and they've moved on to something else already. And with the girl I was working with, all these words that we identified, and actually we needed to work on the meaning of array and the meaning of primary. So sort of words that would then you'd need to know to build on those. Okay, so language is important and language difficulties are common. So a recent study carried out by Professor Courtney Norbury called the SCALES study has taken place in Surrey in the UK. And she found that 7.58% of children have DLD. And that roughly equates to about 2 children in every class of 30. So, you know, clearly it's something that every class teacher needs to understand and know about. Now I've included in here the breakdown of that group of children who have non-verbal IQ in the average range and the below average range. I'll explain sort of a bit more about that as we go on. And then there's children who have language disorder associated with other difficulties, 2.34%, and I'll explain that a bit more later as well. So we're looking close to 10% of children having some sort of language difficulties. Okay, so it's common, it's important, and there's lots of different impacts or outcomes if you have a language disorder, potentially. So we know that how closely language is related to literacy, and DLD is related to dyslexia, as well as understanding of written language. High rates of unemployment and difficulties with independence, and then more difficulties with friendships, more problems with bullying, and a higher risk of psychiatric difficulties. So I wanted to show you this picture that was drawn by a student, Harry, that I worked with. And it was when he was about 12, I think, and we were talking about helping him understand that he had DLD, or SLI as we were calling it at the time. And I said to him that there's another girl I knew who had drawn pictures of what it felt like for her in the classroom. And he immediately said, oh, I'd have, you know, he thought of what his pictures would look like. And he went away and drew these for homework. Now, sorry, it's not so clear on here, but what you can see is a good work board. This is the classroom. a good workboard and a bad workboard. And the bad workboard says Harry, 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 Harry. And the house point chart has Harry at the bottom. I get a bit choked up when I say this, but there's a whole group of kids here having lots of fun, doing lots of things, and then there's one boy in the corner facing the wall crying. And that's how he felt, so that's how he drew how he felt. Of course, it didn't look like that. It was a lovely little classroom, and there was no bad workboard. But a sort of really powerful representation, sort of showing us what it's might be really like for children with DLD. Another example, so actually I'll skip back while I explain it. A little girl I was working with who's at primary level as well, and I've been working with her for a while on a one-to-one basis, and I think we've been doing some talking about feelings, or I've been talking about feelings, words and vocabulary, and at the end of the session she pulled out this little screwed up note from her sleeve and handed it to me, and this is what it said. To Miss Clark, or Miss Clack, I'm there. I'm scared to say this to you. In the classroom, when a teacher said I would do something wrong, I do not know what I am do wrong. Then I do not what and get angry at myself. I know. Oh, sorry, I keep touching my microphone. And she told me the next week when we talked about it that she would ask the teacher and say that she didn't understand, and the teacher would come and give her some help and explain it, and then she still wouldn't understand, and she'd ask again, the teacher would come back and explain again, and then she'd give up. And then it was faff around for the rest of the lesson until the break time came, and then she could get out and go. And then she'd start to get anxious because she'd be going back into that same lesson the next day. Okay, so I'm sure everybody in the audience sort of has experiences with this kind of thing, and we know what the impact can be. Okay, so why is there such a lack of awareness when it's a common difficulty with, you know, significant impacts? One part of this is to do with the research and funding. Dorothy Bishop did an analysis of the research funding in comparison to the severity and the prevalence of different disorders. And she found that, I had to write it down here, that I think it was with ADHD, which is a similar prevalence. It was about, I think, 17 times as much funding as for DLD. So, you know, that's a problem, and I'm sure it's kind of circular, isn't it? That the less awareness there is, the less funding you get, and then the less awareness you get sort of continues. Okay. Possibly influenced by some of these myths that persistent language difficulties are caused by parents, caused by bilingualism, or that people will say that the child will grow out of it. And I've got this link in here for a nice article that was in the Guardian online by Courtney Norbury. Okay, it's really hidden, isn't it? Language difficulties are really hidden. The child's speech may be fine, and that's what people notice and pick up on. Language difficulties aren't visible, and receptive language difficulties, understanding of spoken language, those difficulties are incredibly hard, can be incredibly hard to spot. And children are so good at reading the cues and reading the situation and working out what to do, or nodding in the right places and changing their mind and shaking their head if they realise you wanted a no rather than a yes. And even expressive language difficulties can be hard to pick up. They can be masked by secondary difficulties, so the behaviour issues that you may see, or related difficulties. So often teachers pick up more the problems with learning or the literacy difficulties. And just languages difficulties are just not tangible, are they? You can't see them, and they're difficult for people to understand. And then finally, I think the language demands for children change over time, and you know, the nature of their difficulties also changes. So what part of, you know, some issues that they have early on might somewhat resolve, but then it turns into difficulties in other areas. Yeah.
Could you expand a little bit more towards that, like making it easier for people?
Oh, okay. Okay. Getting me out of the picture, is that?
Okay, so we felt, you know, it's time to get the word out. We need to raise awareness of this difficulty. And in 2011, I got together with this group of people. So Professor Gina Conti-Ramsden, Dorothy Bishop, Courtney Norbury, and Maggie Snowling. And we happened to be sort of all trying to raise awareness and not having a lot of success. And then I brought in my friend Natalie, who is in PR and marketing, who explained to us what we needed to do. And basically we needed a PR marketing campaign, and, you know, very different to the sorts of kind of talks and information that academics certainly had put out before. So Natalie advised that we needed a YouTube channel. So we set up Rally, Raising Awareness of Language Learning Impairments, in 2012, and then subsequently changed the name to RADLD, Raising Awareness of Developmental Language Disorder. These are some of my favourite films, or I think useful films. We've got Signs of SLI, or now DLD, one for teachers, and another for teachers, Teacher Tips. Lovely one, I don't know if anybody's seen Ed and Dill's Meet the Professors, interviewing Gina Conti-Ramsden and Courtney Norbury. Looking Behind Behaviour, which I know Sally has used, and Where's the Word, which you've seen. And this one of my favourites, What's Tricky About Reading, a very simple breakdown of some of the elements, the language, speech and language elements of reading. Okay, so it was very important for us, for the channel, to be evidence-based and be putting out sort of information without any agenda, just this is what the evidence says. So there's also quite a lot of films on there by the academics themselves, explaining, summarising the research. This one's called When to Be Concerned About Late Talkers, for example. And I explained to the academics how useful this is for speech and language therapists, who weren't actually the intended target, but, you know, spend 3 months trying to read the research in one area, or watch a 3-minute film from Dorothy Bishop, you know, there we go. So behind those films, there's also slides on SlideShare and bibliography, so it goes back to the primary source. Okay, a little bit of more background of things that have been going on. So that was the article that I mentioned where Dorothy looked at the funding. We launched the Rally campaign in 2012. There was also a debate at Morehouse School, a specialist school for children with DLD in Surrey, that talked about the criteria and what is SLI, we were calling it at the time. And then Sheena Riley from Australia carried out the IJLCD winter lecture, really questioning the terminology SLI and very much about the specific aspect of the term SLI. And then there was another special issue. There was a special issue of the International Journal that was focusing on all these criteria issues. In 2015 and 16, Dorothy and Bishop and Maggie Snowling led the catalyzed process that Suzanne mentioned, which was really about, the first job was agreeing the criteria. Who are we talking about? What are the criteria? And the second job was then agreeing the terminology. Now what we're going to call it. Now we've decided who they are, what are we going to call it? And this was a process online, so with lots of people, I think 57 experts from different English-speaking countries, and involved various rounds where it started off with a set of statements, and then the people involved would then rate whether they agreed or disagreed with the statements, how strongly, and then refine the statements as well, because there's a lot going on in terms of the statements were a bit ambiguous, and once the statements got refined and refined, things became clearer and people reached more agreement. Okay, so if you want to hear more about that, watch the film, or you can go to there's a couple of journal articles that I've put the link at the end. And this is a useful little slideshow work that Dorothy's put together that has more information about the consensus process and the criteria. Okay, so these were the basic criteria for developmental language disorder. Language difficulties that create obstacles to communication or learning in everyday life. So important to note the functional part of that, and it not just being about assessment scores. The child's problems are unlikely to resolve or have not resolved by 5 years of age. It is possible you can diagnose before 5, but it's more reliable afterwards. And the problems are not associated with a known biomedical condition, so with these other types of issues. Okay. I'm going to go into the criteria a little bit more shortly. And then the terminology developmental language disorder was agreed. It turns out to be compatible with the 2 main diagnostic manuals. The DSM-5 uses language disorder and the ICD-11 developmental language disorder, so that is a bonus. Developmental was used to obviously to indicate developmental and not acquired, and specific being dropped because specific tends to have sort of some unhelpful connotations to do with the nonverbal IQ or to do with having other difficulties as well. And then disorder, to indicate, I think, shows how serious it is and puts it on a par with ASD, DCD, ADHD. Obviously, there's some issues about the word disorder, but there's sort of pros and cons on there of, you know, we're trying to say this is a serious condition, needs to be taken seriously. Okay. So, having set up the YouTube channel and then the catalyzed process, the second article was due to be published, and Natalie and I thought it would be a good idea to have an awareness day, and we could coincide that with the publication of the second journal article, and we were hoping to get some media interest because it's really quite hard to get media interest, but we had something sort of exciting to say about after 200 years of inconsistency. That was now an agreed terminology. So I'm going to show you this film too. This was a film I put together for the Awareness Day, DLD 123, and is featuring the wonderful Eddie and Dylan again. Let's see if I can get out. Oh.
Hi, I'm Eddie, and I'm Liz. We're here to tell about DLD, Developmental Language Disorder. Let's go, hurry up. Come on, we don't have a day. Today we're going to find out about DLD and explain 3 things that you have to know. DLD 1, 2, 3. We're going to teach you to speak, but we can't learn regular. Found you! Have you heard of DLD, Developmental Language Disorder? It's when you have difficulty talking and understanding words. Who has DLD? It affects children and adults. Has it always been called DLD? It's been called lots of things like SLI, but now it's been agreed to be called DLD. What's DLD like? It's just honestly using language. You have to listen what they're saying to you. You just want to speak English, not those big words. It's just making it way more harder. You really want to say something, and it just stops. Your brain just goes, "Is that the word? No, it's not. Is it this one? No, it's not." It's picking out loads of different things. I just want to teleport to the other person's head. They know what it means, but they get what I'm trying to say to them as quickly as I can. Today you are doing DLD is when children All adults have problems with talking or understanding. Well, that's really interesting, Eddie. I'm going to try and find out some more. Why do we need to know about DLD?
It's very important that we know about DLD because it's very common and it's very hidden. A lot of people don't realise that. It affects about 2 children in every classroom, which is really surprising.
So why does it matter?
It is important because it affects reading, writing, learning, joining in with things, and of course self-esteem. We weren't aware our child had DLD because it was hidden. Even though it's common, it's hidden and we weren't understanding that we had difficulties at school, with learning, with understanding, which all affected self-esteem.
There you go, Eddie. It's been common and it's hidden. It can make lots of things hard, like school and reading. It can be hard joining in and being good about it. I see. Let's see if there's any help. What help is out there?
There's all sorts of help. I was helped by speech language therapists, teachers, and other professionals. My parents helped me. In fact, all sorts of people can help you. Your colleagues and your friends too.
How can I help?
It really makes a difference if people can understand about DLD. It's hard for me to explain what DLD means, but when people do understand, it makes a big difference.
So there is help, and everybody can help by knowing about DLD. So remember, DLD, 1, 2, 3. We share our film. Thank you for watching.
Okay. So a lot of fun making that film, as you can imagine, Ellie and Dylan, and also obviously challenges making films with children who've got language difficulties. You know, there with a cameraman who's saying, right, can you say developmental language disorder? I'm going, no, we're not going to get that all in one go. Developmental language disorder. So the awareness day. So the awareness day in 2017. We had all sorts of things going on, people getting involved, and really just promoted via Twitter and Facebook. I can't remember what it's called, Facebook screens. Lots of people doing things in community areas, community centres, raising awareness. Some therapists running a half marathon. We had a quiz that was being translated into different languages, talk going on by Harry at a school, the SPA in Australia ran an event, some more community staff, this British Dyslexia Association getting involved, and a whole group of speech and language therapists, or maybe students in Brazil, so all sorts sort of kicking off. And I think because we now had this agreement on terminology, people were ready to kind of get behind it and get involved. And as speech and language therapists, we've all known about this difficulty for a long time. And finally, there's a way of kind of helping raise awareness. Okay. We also had some success getting in the media. So we had an article in the Times and a couple of online articles and various sort of around the globe as well. And then following on from that, getting in the Times educational supplement, they did a main feature on DLD, which I think was a real result. And what's really made me the happiest is then hearing the journalists from the Times Ed on their podcasts, in subsequent podcasts, asking interviewees, oh, is that maybe DLD? So, you know, we're beginning to get into education more, I suppose. Okay, so following the 2017 Awareness Day, we agreed, the RADLD team agreed we would hand over RADLD to NatPEC, and this is Stephen from NatPEC. And he's got a whole group, an international group involved to help run raising awareness of developmental language disorder, and then it's kicked off even further. And there's a lovely website now as well. And the 2019 Awareness Day, the slogan was DLD, you and me, and the idea was to get young people, families, professionals to give their stories about DLD. And so there were written accounts, and then there's lots of lovely films about DLD from the children's viewpoints. That's lovely. Now, possibly, if we have time at the end, we could watch Lily's. It's one of my favourite. An amazing animation. I mean, you know, looking at a young person who's got language difficulties and the skills she must have to have created that and telling her story. Okay, lots of events happened this year. So we had Michael Rosen, or somebody had Michael Rosen speaking at what has become DLD Awareness Week for them. All sorts of things going on. This is Ghana. Sophie got a tattoo. Sophie's an adult with DLD. This is New Zealand NZSTA tweeting, yeah, and all sorts of other things. And remarkably, we also had light ups. So this is various places around the globe being lit purple or yellow. If I can remember, this is Bournemouth Pier, the UK. This is in Omaha, the Optus Stadium in Perth, I think. Iceland, a university in Iceland, the Bolt Bridge in Melbourne, and the Niagara Falls. Fantastic. Okay. So, to go into a little bit more now about the criteria and breaking down the criteria for clinicians. Oh, sorry again. First of all, sort of the first issue with Catalyse is really about thinking about labels and the use of labels. And obviously there are pros and cons of giving somebody a diagnosis. And I wondered if anybody would suggest any of the things that you think might be a drawback, a con of having a label. What are people concerned about? Stigma, yeah.
I was thinking that everybody thinks DLD is the same. It's not. Could you repeat that?
Okay, so the question again. Oh, okay. So people thinking that anyone with DLD has the same difficulties. Yeah.
Giving people yet another issue they didn't know they had.
Yeah. So giving people another issue that they didn't know they had. Okay. And what about the positives? Funding. Okay. As in for support.
Label tends to attract funding.
So a label continuing. Yeah. So a label continuing to attract funding. And are you talking about for support, for intervention, or for research? I guess.
I think both for services and for research. If you don't have a specific name,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Just another comment to you set up a dichotomy between normal and
Yeah. Okay. Any more thoughts? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So they stop searching.
Just saying families can, well, not that they necessarily should stop searching, but sometimes that settles things because it gives a focus on their needs.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think if any of us have a difficulty, we want to know, well, what is this? Give us an explanation. whether that's a medical difficulty or a learning difficulty. Okay. I might skip on to my slide, which is probably covers, we've probably already said most of these. So the cons, not an accurate description of difficulties, as every child or person with DLD is different, and perhaps people could make assumptions. If you've got DLD, that this is what your difficulties you're going to have. It's creating a category that doesn't really, you know, there isn't a line between you've got DLD and you haven't, you've got language difficulties and you haven't, and there's so many different dimensions of language that can be affected. And people can be concerned, parents can be concerned that a diagnosis may limit opportunities or affect attitudes or lower expectations, and maybe an adult with DLD might be concerned about being patronised in some way. And then on the pro side, obviously it's a shorthand way to give people an idea of what your difficulties are, what the child's difficulties are, and how they can help. Help the parent or child, an adult, understand their difficulties. So as Suzanne said, what the reasons are. Find support. How do I find support if I don't even know what my difficulty is? For speech and language therapy, for other services, and also communities. So find other parents, finding, you know, other parents to support each other and help, help each other. Raising the profile and understanding. If we're all using different terminology, that's hard. And, you know, I don't know, as a speech and language therapist, for years, all these different terms being used, I couldn't really get my head around it. You know, if we're not using the same term, how are we helping raise awareness and helping these children? And then research, need a clear group to be researching. Okay. This is a quote from Alicia, who's actually in the word finding film. It helps when, you know, if you tell someone you've got it, they know, like, it's actually a thing. So she thinks it's good, it's a thing, is what she said to me. Okay. So I think, you know, it's important that we're aware of the drawbacks of having a label so we can try and mitigate those issues. So this comes from the catalysed process. In the UK, we talk about speech, language and communication needs. Is that a term used here? Yeah, as a kind of the broad category that covers everything, any speech, language and communication difficulties. And within that, catalysed has said, so this is all SLCN. This section here, I don't know if you can see that well, speech difficulties. This one is language disorder, and then within language disorder, we've got developmental language disorder. Okay. And here shows the types of difficulties that we can have within DLD. Okay, so just to sort of clarify that a little bit. So if a child has severe and persistent language difficulties that impair social and/or educational functioning, they can get a diagnosis of language disorder. And it could be language disorder associated with another condition or DLD. And here's some examples. So associated with could be ASD, brain injury, genetic disorder, intellectual disability and other issues. And these would be catalysed called differentiating conditions. And these are conditions where not necessarily causal of language difficulties, but that often has language difficulties, and there may be a different type of intervention required. But these difficulties can go along with DLD. So dyslexia, obviously, DCD, ADHD, speech difficulties, and emotional and behavioural difficulties. So those are just examples, there will be others as well. Non-verbal IQ. Now, in the UK, that's been quite a big thing, and here as well, no? Okay, so to whiz through this then, in non-verbal IQ, you can have language disorder associated with intellectual disability. Now, to have intellectual disability, the DSM-5 states there has to be both intellectual deficits and adaptive deficits, so a failure to meet standards for personal independence. Typically, this means an IQ of below 70 and limitations of adaptive behaviour. So if the child doesn't meet those criteria, so they've got sort of a low nonverbal IQ, but not that low, or doesn't have the adaptive difficulties, then they could still get a diagnosis of DLD. Okay, so in the UK, there has been, in practice, if a child has had low nonverbal IQ, they often wouldn't get a diagnosis of DLD or SLI. And this would have implications for support. Just skip on to that one. So studies have shown that there's actually no difference between the language difficulties of those children who have average nonverbal IQ and those who have lower nonverbal IQ. So we're making a line where there is a division where there isn't one. And those kids with a lower nonverbal IQ also respond to intervention. There isn't evidence that they're not going to respond to intervention. And in the UK, sometimes these kids weren't getting support because they didn't fit into the SLI, into the diagnosis, and sitting in no man's land. Okay, so another issue for us has been about the use of the term delay, language delay, and for thinking about school-age children. This was sometimes used to describe a child who had language difficulties across the board, so all assessments were showing difficulties, whereas disorder had been used if a child had a more spiky profile of language difficulties. But Catalyze, drawing on the evidence base, that previous evidence base, showed that there's no evidence for separating this into delay disorder. It doesn't make sense to say these kids are delayed and not disordered. And in fact, those with a flat profile of language difficulties are likely to be more needy. Another issue is about subtypes of language difficulties. So in the past, people have tried to categorize, and I think there's a categorization called from Rappin and Allen some years back, but researchers found that these subtypes aren't reliable, and we just need to describe the child's individual profile. Okay. Just to add, make a note, just one of my showing pragmatic language example, but DLD, or to highlight to you that DLD includes pragmatic language difficulties as well. Okay. In terms of assessment, Catalyze advised, because of the functional element of a diagnosis, that assessment draws on multiple sources of information. So we're not just looking at assessment scores, but observation of the child if appropriate, and interviews and questionnaires with parents and with professionals. Sometimes, the things show more in the classroom, don't they? They're more obvious than on the testing, or vice versa. Okay. Thinking about very young children, so before they go to school, there's huge variation in the development of language. And so it's hard, and many children catch up. So it's hard to know when to be concerned. And Catalyze highlighted some of the red flags, the risk factors of when you might be concerned. And these included comprehension difficulties, a wide range of language skills being affected, family history of language or literacy difficulties, and poor use of gesture. Although I think the poor use of gesture might be more associated with more sort of ASD type difficulties. If there's signs of atypical development or of frustration. So in terms of what support at that age, I've heard Courtney Norbury talk about sort of having a conversation with the parent about risk factors. And so, looking at your child's difficulties and you haven't got family history, their comprehension appears to be good, the signs look good for he's going to catch up or she's going to catch up. Whereas if there's other risk factors that you might be sort of saying, you're more concerned. So advice might be watchful waiting, advice for the parents on supporting language, targeted intervention, or getting more stuck in with specialist support. So at this age as well, language delay is not recommended. Has that been used here, language delay, preschool? Yeah. So it's, you know, very common in the UK that language delay would be the terminology used for before school. And it's suggested that, well, there's been different discussions, I think, outside Catalyse and what terminology we should use, whether it's just say language difficulties, SLCN, a late talker, or at risk of language disorder, or at risk of DLD. So I think at that age, perhaps we can't tell whether the child's going to catch up or not. So if we're saying language delay, we're implying that they're going to catch up. Okay, and that was an issue for the school-age children as well, actually. So the use of the term language delay for school-age children. So if you've got a child who's 14 and they're diagnosed with language delay, it implies that they're going to catch up. Well, it's not likely they're going to catch up. They've got a disorder. Okay, so just to add to that, it's not predictable. There are poor language skills early on and concerns early on. There may not be long-term issues, but also you can have children who look fine early on and then difficulties arise later on. And my hunch is that that might be more the pragmatic language issues become more apparent later on. And those children who have uncomplicated phonological difficulties, these are likely to resolve. Which are likely to resolve wouldn't be categorised as DLD, wouldn't be given a diagnosis of DLD. Okay. So another important point is about the persistence of language difficulties. So the research is showing that if a child gets to school age and they've got language difficulties, it's highly likely they're going to continue to have language difficulties. So earlier on, it's a little bit more difficult to predict. As they get to 4, it's more likely it's going to be persistent. As they get to 5, you can be more sure. And this is just some data from Professor Courtney Norbury's scale study, where she's showing typically developing children and children with DLD, the red line, and language disorder, the green, and how the gap stays the same, or is predicted to stay the same. Okay. So considerations really, I think for us as speech and language therapists, is do we have the confidence to diagnose and use the term DLD? And I feel in the UK there's a little bit of a hurdle for us to kind of be brave to say this child has developmental language disorder, but also, you know, the implications of that. If the child's not really severe, that giving a label disorder is quite significant. There's issues around what terminology we use at preschool. And we've got to be mindful of the persistent nature of language difficulties. Many young children will catch up, and once they're at school age, they're less likely to. There's a big drive for early intervention, and if early intervention means preschool, it's just being careful how we're using our resources. Should all our resources go into preschool, and some of those kids are going to catch up anyway, and we've got to be aware that children with language children will need support at school age. Okay, and also thinking about, given the lifelong nature of DLD, what intervention should look like. Okay. So, thinking about support then, with that in mind. In terms of what speech and language therapy support looks like, has anybody got any thoughts on when we think about the lifelong nature of DLD, what the aims of intervention might be, what we might need to include? No? So I skip on to what I think. So at these different ages, this is something I put together as a link to my website about what I think speech and language therapy should be. So up here we've got the skills obviously it's important to work on language skills to help those kids with the fundamentals of language, help them access the curriculum, help them communicate, help them with independence. But we're not going to fill in all the gaps, and a few weeks on a certain aspect of language isn't going to sort the child's language out. So the child also needs to be equipped with strategies to get around their difficulties for life and for learning. And we need to help these kids and adults with awareness of their difficulties, to understand that this is called DLD, if they're, obviously presenting these things in a sensitive way. Having somebody to talk with about their difficulties, who gets it, who understands. They're not the only one. You've got lots of strengths, and these can, these are really important and valid, and can help you with your learning. And I think it's very hard for children who have DLD, because learning is language based, isn't it? And thinking back to Harry's picture, every day being in that environment where you're just listening to lots of language and potentially not getting it and feeling like you're the only one and there's something wrong with you. So I think it's really important that we support kids with that too. And then supporting parents and families, other professionals, to understand these difficulties and to help the children with skills, strategies and self-awareness as well. And in the long run, and in the short run as well, so while the children are at school, but in the long run as adults, developing their self-advocacy skills. So we want this young person to grow up to be an adult who can go into the workplace and say, I have DLD and this is how I need you to explain things to me, or I need you to say things more slowly, or can you write things down, etc., etc. Okay. This film, Speech and Language Therapy Helping Michael, sort of in essence gives some examples of those different aspects of therapy. And here's another little film that was done by Alicia, who was the girl who said seahorse in the word finding film, and then gave us the quote about DLD being a thing. So she talked about what developmental language disorder is for her, and then went on to talk about therapy and happened to talk about kind of her strategies and now being confident to talk about it and those sorts of things, and what a difference that's made to her and being happy with herself. Okay. So I was going to show that film. We can. Okay, here we go. Oh, so I'm not sure what's happened with the sound there. It's a bit blurry. Maybe it's just a lower quality film. Try again.
I would say it comes in different forms. So we have it because I'm could be totally different from someone else with it. Kind of things you find difficult within the DLD. I find retaining information. Sometimes I put it in my head, I go, I want to say to someone, but it doesn't always come out right. I sometimes have to go over it, what I said out loud and say again. Do you have any difficulty finding words you want to say? Yeah, all the time. It's ever quite difficult to get your message across to people. Yeah, because my words are my jumble. How do you manage that? Oh well, I learned loads of different strategies. the strategy to do it. And for example, like I've learned so many different strategies, but sometimes some things I do find really difficult. Now I don't find that it difficult. I don't even know that I have that problem so much anymore because I've got strategies to be able to understand it. What do you think about you? My confidence, I've got social confidence person. Very people doing more, or you haven't done before that. Oh, I do. I hated public speaking. Absolutely hated it. But now I've got so confident as a person that like I've done speeches, stuff like that to people, and now in fact I even enjoy it, but I never thought it happened. What would you recommend to somebody who just found out to get a lot of people together? Even though it is hard to accept how I personally like DLD as independent as possible, but because I was able to accept how I have become so much more confident as a person, which is such a nice feeling because before I was scared to be myself around people, and more increasingly I'm becoming like more myself in front of people, and people are accepting it, which is such a nice feeling that I don't have to pretend to be someone else. Because let's be real, it's easier to be yourself than anyone else. So yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. Yeah, so she's come a long way, Alicia, and now really wanting to be an advocate and tell people about DLD and how support can help. Okay, so thinking about next steps. So far, if I change the sound on this, was it on? Okay. Okay, is that better? Is that better? I've turned it down on the laptop. Oh, I think Liz maybe turned it up, the video. I just whisper. Try not to shout. Okay, so we've made a lot of progress in terms of making, I think we've found a way of making DLD more visible and explaining what it is, although I have to say the videos, most of the videos that we've put out don't really show the language difficulties a lot, because of course we were filming children and sort of not necessarily wanting to put on the internet them struggling, but we, you know, that might come in the future. We've got resources that are shareable, and you know, social media has helped a lot. I think it's been so key, the catalyzed process, and having now an agreed terminology in terms, you know, for raising awareness and supporting these children, and agreed criteria. Momentum is building. So Awareness Day, the first Awareness Day was in 2017, and there was already lots of people supporting RADLD, getting on board, and then by the second Awareness Day, other people had seen what happened last year and more was happening, and third Awareness Day, more and more, so it's fantastic, and families getting involved too. We're still issues to work out on the criteria and terminology, and it'll probably never be perfect. There's always going to be kind of pros and cons of some of the decisions, but there's still issues that are coming up to be sorted, and we've still got a lot of work to do in terms of raising awareness and identification and assessment, and sort of looking at ways of assessing and the kind of support that's needed, thinking about what we were just talking about in terms of strategies and awareness and self-advocacy. Okay, so these would be my hopes for the future, that everybody knows about DLD, that it's as well known as dyslexia and autism, and that those with DLD are understood by others, yeah, because people have an idea of what that means. We have improved identification and support, and the term DLD holds some currency. So it means something, and difficulty with sort of talking to children at the moment and saying you have developmental language disorder is that none of their friends know what that is, and they've not heard of it before. But if it comes sort of part of the normal conversation, then it holds currency and it has a meaning. And help these children develop their sense of self and self-advocacy skills. Crucial that we can help teachers understand more about developmental language disorder, how fundamental language is to learning, and both with learning and other aspects of life, sort of increasing recognition of the relevance of language, for learning and life. There's another issue there for us to think about too, is making language more accessible for adults with DLD, so to be independent. You know, even just coming here and doing my form on the plane for coming into New Zealand, and I'm thinking, gosh, if I had DLD, how would I fill this in? It's hard enough to understand when you haven't, you know. Also, all these sort of everyday forms, filling in the new visa thing I've had to do. Some of it is like double negatives in there, like which one am I meant to tick? You know, so we've got a lot of work to do to try and make things more accessible. And then I think we need to look at what the goals of intervention are for children with DLD, taking into account what we know about the persistent nature, and having appropriate measures of progress. So I mean that we're not just looking at self-scores, we're looking at, has this child now got strategies? Is this child more able to deal with their difficulties? Has it reduced the impact on their behaviour? Or, you know, are they feeling better about themselves? What's their quality of life like? And the research will need to reflect that too. You know, we're not looking at, I think it's tricky, isn't it, if we have research intervention studies that are looking at trying to improve language scores, those standardised scores, when actually as therapists that's might not be what our goals are. Okay. So just to say thank you to all the children, young people and adults with DLD who were filmed for us, and the family members and professionals. It's quite daunting to be filmed sometimes, I think, even as a professional. I mean, the looks on some of the faces of the therapists who are filmed once they walked in and saw the setup and sort of then backing out the door. So these children who were happy to put themselves on the internet to be filmed doing what they found most difficult, talking, telling about their difficulties, and then that going out to the world. And at the very beginning, none of them even knowing what the YouTube channel was going to look like. I didn't even know what the YouTube channel was going to look like, and just putting their trust in us. So I think I'm forever grateful to them. I've got some questions for us to kind of consider for New Zealand. I'm just going to finish on one of my favourite quotes from a little boy that I work with, and I don't know if you have this in the self or the old self here, but this is an item from the expressive vocabulary test, and the child can see the pictures and I can see the words. And I said to him, what is this? And he said, a baby cow. So I could give him 1 point, but I'm allowed to say, oh, what do we call a baby cow? What do we call a baby cow? And he had a little think and looked up at the ceiling. Maria? Okay, so I'm feeling a little bit rattled now. But actually, rattled turns out to mean showing signs of age or fatigue and being haggard, gone, hollow-eyed and drawn. So having only flown in at the weekend, the jet lag's kicking in, but I hope that was useful. And then at the end of the presentation, I've put in some other links and films that you can look at, and a few thoughts for how you DLD in New Zealand, really. And also hoping, you know, that you can get involved more in the awareness day perhaps next year. So I think we said you are using the term DLD. A little bit. Is terminology used at all? Anybody got any thoughts? No? Would people perhaps feel more confident to start using it, or are there other issues that would mean that it's harder over here?
Hi. I find the use of the word disorder difficult. Obviously when it's more hardwired, so you can find onwards, then DLD is if I can understand that. Obviously, in time I said, well, I'm sure the language disadvantage. And so it's not really not a disorder as in wired the word go. It's sort of an acquired difficulty because of their exposure to language and with trauma and attachment. So for me, I suppose disorder means one particular thing as a condition. So it's
yeah. So in those early years, you might be saying there's language difficulties here, or some needs, and then as if the child gets to 5 and you're still concerned, then
and I suppose one of the things is I don't know in the UK, but in ministry education, and I think very, very, very extreme things. And so there's always this sort of balance between saying how things are as opposed to but it's very different. It's doing a fine line between saying something which is really negative as opposed to destructive.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, in an ideal world, as practitioners, we just want to describe the difficulties and help them, don't we? And I think there's all these other issues about a diagnosis that can be helpful to the child or adult and the family. So yeah.
I've got a few questions that people have put on the Zoom link, which I'll read out in a minute. But I think one of the things for us in New Zealand is that many children are coming from backgrounds of different languages and communities in their homes, and a lot of our assessment tools are not always very helpful for some of those children. And so I think there's often the awareness that we don't want to penalise children and medicalise or for the same reason, saying really that sometimes there's often disadvantage as well as difference in the language backgrounds. So the tools that we have, which perhaps are more valid in countries with bigger populations and more valid norms, just not here for us yet. So certainly the populations that I work with, there are all those other factors that might be causing the language issues that we might be seeing. It can be really difficult to know, are we really seeing what we think we might be seeing? There's a tendency that we want to negatively label children when we might not have the right reasons. So those are some of the debates that I think we need to have in New Zealand around what the frameworks that work here, what are the right cultural frameworks that are going to be needed for us to be able to be confidently using terms that are respectful of what we're actually seeing. I might just read out some of the questions that people have been putting in here. So there might be too many for me to.
Could I just say on that point, Sally, so there's the issue, the sort of bilingualism or multilingualism issue, but obviously perhaps the emphasis on going for the family's view. Are they concerned about the child's language in the home language?
And it might not only be language, so it's often cultural aspects of communication, which means that children might not perform on tests in a way that perhaps the normal population might. So then they're not always valid in terms of making a really strong, confident interpretation of the testing. And also we're just not testers in the same way that perhaps UK nations are, because it hasn't been necessary to have tests for their different services for maybe.
Which is a good thing.
Yeah, and certainly
perhaps.
when I worked Some of the things that people have said, could you please clarify the percentile cut-off for DLD?
I don't think the Catalyse gives a percentile cutoff. It's more about your professional judgment of a significant impact on the child's communication or learning. And, you know, I think it's very, very difficult for us as clinicians to decide where to draw that line. And I've looked at profiles of children, whether, you know, if a child's kind of got poor language skills across the board, okay, well, that's a bit easier. But what if they're quite good here and lower, you know, so their short-term verbal memory is low, but their vocabulary is quite high and the syntax is low? And, you know, so what weight do we put to different areas? And so I think it's about a judgment of the impact as much. I don't know, you know, do we base diagnosis on underlying skills, on how they're performing on tests, on what you see in the classroom or functionally, or what the impacts are? Yeah, so sorry, there isn't a nice neat answer, but.
Can I just raise a point like that? The interesting thing is that the interesting thing is that figure of 2 children per classroom had to come with some criteria. And if those criteria were actually from standardised tests, then we've got ourselves in a conundrum as to how do you decide what the diagnostic category. I hate the term diagnostic category, but you know, we're calling it DLD, we're calling it DLD because we want something out of that term. But if, as practitioners, we don't want to use the same diagnostic criteria that they use in research, where does that leave us?
I'm not sure that's a question I can answer, but yeah, a very good point, isn't it? And I think, I'm sorry, I haven't got in my head what the cutoff was for Courtney's scales study, but I think the link will be on there if people want to have a look.
I think, there probably the answer is more than 2 per classroom because there were quite severe criteria and those specific applications. If you talk about what Becky is saying about impact, there would be more children.
I think it's very hard, isn't it?
There's a question about dyslexia. If you have dyslexia, does that mean therefore that you have DLD, or can you have dyslexia but not DLD?
Okay, I guess I can give my views on it, but you know, some people describe dyslexia as a language difficulty. It could come under that category. And, you know, dyslexia, the fundamentals of dyslexia, the research shows, doesn't it, that it's a speech processing difficulty, not sort of the visual issues that people used to think were underpinning dyslexia, so the phonological processing issues. I guess it depends, the question could be theory or practice. And I think in theory, perhaps we could say if you've got dyslexia, although I guess if it's only impacting on decoding and encoding literacy, then it's not impacting on spoken communication and understanding in the classroom, then perhaps it isn't DLD. So I think, but in practice, dyslexia is a term that's well understood, isn't it, and well known and works, and perhaps is a particular profile of language difficulties. That's the speech processing. Sometimes the auditory memory and word finding difficulties go alongside, don't they? So sorry, not very clear answer on that, but you can have big diagnosis with both, obviously. But I think for some children, if their profile is very much that dyslexia profile, then just stick with dyslexia.
Another question, sorry to mention that. Would you say, Becky, that the DLD criteria is a wide range of children and specific language impairment due to the inclusion of children's level of learning difficulties above the criteria that I do?
Yeah, because it includes the lower non-verbal IQ. Yes, in theory, yes, yeah. And it kind of opens up the door also for us to be diagnosing without having to refer to an educational psychologist to look at non-verbal IQ. I mean, I've had some experiences where Educational psychology reports show low non-verbal IQ and high verbal IQ, or average verbal IQ, and that was for one child who was the most language disordered that I was working with, and was very bright and remembering things and telling me what we agreed we would do last week. So I think there's a little bit of a question mark about IQ testing, isn't there, really, and it being a static measure rather than a sort of dynamic, looking at the child's ability to learn. So, yeah.
Just doing another comment from the Zoom people. Someone made a comment here. There is research that suggests developmental language disorder occurs in deaf children when they define language users. Therefore, it seems that renewal hearing loss and DLD together. Research also suggests a similar occurrence around 7%.
Okay, I know that this is something I brought up within Catalyse when sensory neural hearing loss, hearing impairment got put in the language disorder side rather than the DLD side, and that I've had experience of working with children who've had hearing impairment and over and above language difficulties. And there happens to be, I think, quite a lot of conversation going on about that, and Dorothy Bishop's had a lot of communication with people, and she sort of feels like, I think she emailed me saying she thinks there needs to be another Catalyse process looking at that side of things. So yeah, I guess it's not an area that I understand well enough to sort of say more on, but I just know that it's under discussion.
And I think this last one often actually relates to that, which Suzanne might be able to respond to. But what are your thoughts about APD and DLD?
Yeah. Well, I think I'm less familiar with the term APD, and I think I'm looking at the language difficulties and how to support those, really. But so maybe, Suzanne, would you want to answer that?
Well, clearly they can co-occur, but they don't have to co-occur. And I think there are some people that have held the view that developmental language disorders are always caused by an auditory problem, which we know not to be the case. We just looked at a group of 90 children and tried to cluster them. We did statistically cluster them with some children who actually had clear auditory processing but great language strengths, and other children who struggled across the board with literacy, language, and auditory processing. So there were different groupings of children, which I think clinically everybody knows that they can co-occur, but they don't have to co-occur. And one of the challenges has arisen when we've had some researchers make statements that this is the cause of developmental language disorder, and some of your colleagues in the UK have put a lot of effort into showing that that's not the case. And those people that made those statements in the 70s probably should be able to get that.
Sure.
The answers in the simple. I don't know if I answered that question for you. Yeah. Okay.
I'm not sure they're hearing very well at home.
I'm just wondering, is developmental language disorder a lifelong disorder, right? It's you assume that the child will learn strategies to cope with it if good therapists, but they will always have it.
Yes, I mean, I guess, do we know enough to know whether some children could improve? And I think, from my perspective, I think, if we look at kind of a 6-year-old and say that maybe they've got underlying phonological difficulties and maybe syntax difficulties, perhaps those areas of language are a little bit more finite and that they could sort of do well in those areas. Whereas if you've got difficulties with vocabulary and pragmatics, then perhaps that's, the vocabulary is always going to be, is just infinite, isn't it? The amount of vocabulary in learning, and pragmatic language demands really ramp up towards the end of primary and into secondary. So I guess I couldn't say personally, you know, that you've got a child who's age 5, that's it. You know, you're always going to have these difficulties. I think the research is indicating that for most children it is likely to be lifelong. I think it's important to say that although, you know, I've painted a bit of a doom and gloom picture here, I've shown the negative impacts. Children and adults can do well with DLD, can't they? And I think personally, I feel that school age is the hardest time because they don't have a choice and it's just loads of language. You know, I've worked with 15-year-old boys who have to get their English GCSE. Well, one wanted to be a tree surgeon and one, you know, wanted to be a car mechanic. And unfortunately, we're having to, you know, in the UK, they have to get their English GCSE and then you don't get it, you have to retake it. You don't get it, you have to retake it. So I guess it's a long-winded way of saying mostly, yes, I think, but we need to, I think for families, you know, sort of bear in mind that these children have lots of strengths and they can do really well in life, but you know, we want to try and equip them as best we can.
You might homework during the discussion or in your mind, but if you pop up and just stand near the laptop, all it's different. Sorry to do that. I didn't know anything out otherwise. Sorry.
Hi, I suppose as not anybody in here, I mean, most people in here would agree that assessment is not a dirty word, particularly because it's not just a test, it's looking at observation and function and everything like that, but certainly a lot in the education setting and often in schools, assessment is not a good word. And I suppose what the schools often end up doing is relying on parent opinion and teacher opinion. And so we've been looking in very disadvantaged schools, and one of the things that's been really highlighted when we've looked at formal assessments of speech language therapy and functional classroom observations, etc., is that there's a huge discrepancy and there's a new level of norm. So in disadvantaged communities, it's normal to be significantly delayed or disordered in your language. So it isn't identified by either parents or by teachers because it's just what everybody else is. And so you end up with this big groups, populations who are not being identified and who are not getting the input that they really need, and that potentially the people who are more advantaged, who have some resources, can then get private assessments and can get some input. So there's a big inequity. You don't have to answer that one because
And I think there's also that issue with sort of potentially the kind of genetic links that sometimes parents can have the difficulties themselves.
I think a lot of it is the social disadvantage, just not being exposed to rich language, and also a whole lot of the other things: stress, alcohol, those childhood experiences, poverty, etc.
It's very interesting to hear sort of the difference about the assessment side of things over here.
I think I need to stand closer to Becky.
It might be, it's coming through my microphone.
No, it's picking up from the laptop.
So, yeah, okay. I just wanted to ask you, Becky, talking about functional ways of thinking about developmental language disorder, and New Zealand really doesn't use standardised assessments that much for all the reasons we've been talking about. But what we don't have is some really nice tools that will look at things like participation, changes in wellbeing that you talked about before, so that to retain the government-funded support, we have to show we're getting some outcomes. And just talking to a data analysis person in the Ministry of Education recently, they're struggling to find tools. And I wonder if there's any work going on in the UK around some great tools for us that we could adapt or use.
Maybe that's one for me to take back to Professor Bishop, Snowling and Norbury and Conti Ramsden, but yeah, I think it's really important, isn't it? I think and it can be quite hard looking at kind of self-esteem measures or perhaps self-awareness measures, but sometimes it gets worse before it gets better. And then there's teenage factors as well, you know, sort of comparing to the norm, I suppose. But working with children to help them understand their difficulties, you know, I think having seen it sort of clinically sometimes can be a bit of a drop in their self-esteem, and then, you know, you build on that. And Alicia's perhaps a good case there. Yeah, so yeah, that's definitely a way forward, isn't it? You're going to come up again?
James Laura's talked about language being a social role in well-being indicator, but what would you measure for the indicator? From my experience, it's hugely relevant to how disadvantaged happens going, but we don't have a nice measure.
I'm not sure I understand the question or the comment. So in terms of reflecting social...
I suppose that James Laura said that language disadvantage is a really important well-being indicator.
Yeah.
It's something that societies should measure and monitor. I'm not sure actually what he's talking about, which indicator is he talking about, because realistically, we're not going to get formal language assessments, either sort of self-pay or even functional or even anything else on all of these to measure to have it as a well-being indicator.
Okay, yeah.
Realistic and practical as a society, we have that measures language disadvantage.
Yeah. Yeah, and language is so diverse, isn't it? So, you know, one measure may show a child doing well and another severe difficulties. Okay, should we finish there? Okay.
Well, Becky, I'm very grateful that you came to talk to us, and I'm sorry to disrupt your holiday and make you do a talk while you're here, but it's been really interesting and helpful for us. And I think we've had a lot of people participating via Zoom as well as those of us in the room, and I think that will open up some really great conversations for us next year. And I think we're very grateful for your amazing work in this area and the clear passion you have for making things better for children and young people and as they grow into adults. So I have a little gift I'll just nip and get for you, but to say thank you. And just a support. Just a wee little thing to say. Thanks so much. We're really grateful. Thanks for people at home for bearing with the technology. We did our best, and I have tried to audio record and video record it, so hopefully we'll have that as a record. And I think myself, Suzanne, Liz and Jane from Canterbury, we're thinking maybe there's a follow-up day that needs to happen on this topic, because clearly there's some things that we haven't got sorted yet about what we all think and what we need here in New Zealand. So bear with us and we'll maybe put our heads together for the new year, but I think we need a Christmas break first. So yeah, travel well and come and eat a bit more food before you go, and thanks people at home.
Thanks to turn off here.